Enterprise Management 360.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Tech Chat. Now in today's episode, I'm going to be speaking with Daniel dos Santos, Research Manager at Forescout Research Labs. So Daniel, welcome to the show and thanks for coming on today.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. I'm happy to discuss our research.
Exactly. Yeah, no, excited to have you on, and we've got a good conversation planned. As Daniel says, we're going to be delving into their new research. So this is Forescout Research Labs' latest report, and it's called NameWreck, which discloses a range of new DNS vulnerabilities affecting 4 popular transmission control protocol and internet protocol stacks. So a lot of good stuff to kind of get into here. There's some great findings in the report. And I wanted to start the show here, Daniel, by just asking what are those key findings of the report and what impact is this new information set to have on the world of business security?
Right, that's a great question. So the main findings are that several DNS client implementations are vulnerable to a similar set of vulnerabilities, right? So we started from previous research that we had, part of this larger initiative that we call Project Memoria, where we're looking at several TCP/IP stacks. And we also looked at research that other researchers had done in the past in DNS, and found a set of similar problems, let's say, that occur in DNS. And then we kind of translated those, like we systematized and enumerated those and looked into how they would reflect into some new targets, some new TCP/IP stacks, which led us to a set of 9 new vulnerabilities. So from these, you can actually look at 2 main findings, let's say. The fact that these DNS client issues are widespread and the fact that they are widespread in TCP/IP stacks. So one is kind of interesting per se, which means that you can look at other targets and find other types of vulnerabilities, which is something that we did. But the other one is also reflected on this IoT world that we live nowadays, right? So every IP connected device has a TCP/IP stack. And the fact that 4 of those very popular TCP/IP stacks suffer from this type of vulnerability means that several millions of devices out there are vulnerable, and also that this can be, again, even more widespread in other stacks and so on that we haven't yet looked at. So I think that the main findings really are the types of vulnerabilities and the fact that they are reflected in many stacks. And in terms of kind of business impact, why does that actually matter for people, right? So it's really the fact that we're seeing a kind of a transition in vulnerabilities from the IT world to the IoT world, where we just have many more devices nowadays that are online, that are exposing the networks of organizations to the internet, or that are exposing them to external attackers and so on, right? So we're seeing this transition from the IT to the IoT attack surface, and this type of vulnerability that kind of started in IT gets translated to the IoT world and basically greatly enlarges the attack surface that companies should be looking at.
100% agree. It's that growth and evolution, really. It's not just the growth of one area. It is now bleeding over into different ones. As you said, with the IoT space, there's a lot of areas to kind of cover within that. I'm curious, obviously, when we speak about the DNS element of all of this, do you have any real world scenarios or examples that you can give of how bad actors can take advantage of these newfound DNS vulnerabilities?
Basically, there has been a lot of research in DNS vulnerabilities in the past, but that focused on the DNS servers, not so much on the DNS client. So what we are doing is a little bit different. And there were some cases of real attacks and exploitations in the past looking at the DNS servers, right? But what we are doing now for DNS clients is shifting those attack scenarios a little bit. But basically, some real world possibilities allow attackers to either poison the cache of devices, DNS cache, or send malicious messages directly to the DNS clients in the devices, and basically either take full control of a device via remote code execution or take a device offline via a denial of service. So this is like the basic that you can do with a vulnerability, let's say, but then you can put those in real attack scenarios, right? More complex things. So for instance, with the remote code execution, an attacker can be able to get a foothold into a network and from there do some lateral movement and then compromise other parts of the network. Then reaching a target where maybe the goal can be a denial of service. So you take, for instance, a critical device offline. We see lots of built-in automation controllers that are vulnerable to this vulnerability. So maybe the goal of an attacker is in the end to, I don't know, switch off the lights at a retail or something like that, right? So you basically can target a specific building automation controller that runs this. And since we're talking about IoT, just the physical effects of these things are really varied.
Exactly. It's very interesting, isn't it, to kind of see how those different points come into play and how that's being affected going forward. And it leads me nicely on to my last question, because it's all about, wow, what actions do we take? So how can companies really take action to better protect themselves from threats, especially when it comes to securing, the four popular TCP IP stacks? When we're talking about FreeBSD, IPNet, NucleusNet, and NetX, how can they take proper action and see results?
Right. That's a great question. So all of the vulnerabilities that we reported have been patched by the stack vendors, which means that the downstream vendors, so the vendors that use those stacks in their devices, should be issuing their patches, and then organizations can download those patches and apply them and so on. But that's, let's say, the best case scenario, right? The fact is that the patches for the downstream vendors, they sometimes take months to be issued, and in the meantime, organizations might not be protected. And even when these patches are issued, sometimes it may be difficult for an organization to patch an IoT device depending on its criticality or what actually is its business purpose. Imagine, for instance, a medical device at a hospital, at an ICU nowadays, that are super overstretched with demands from COVID and so on. Everything that I described in the patching effort is more or less easier, right? Like, you can identify a device, you have the patches directly from the FreeBSD community, and it's easier to apply them and so on. But for IoT devices, you typically have to do that for each specific vendor manufacturer, for each specific IoT device that you have on your network. So that's much more complicated. So now that I spoke about all of these challenges, right, with patching, what can actually be done to overcome this? So one of the best approaches nowadays to network security is segmentation, right, where you basically try to isolate devices that are affected, or even proactively, even if you don't know if they're affected, but they're critical devices in your network, you try to isolate them, both to avoid them being an entry point in your network, but also to avoid that attackers that have gained access to these devices use them as a kind of a pivot point within your network, right? So kind of limiting the blast radius of an attack in your network. So network segmentation is absolutely critical nowadays. And other recommendations that we are given to the community now is, of course, try to rely on internal DNS servers as much as possible, so that you're not exposing your devices to some external communication that you might not be aware of. And also monitor the network internally, specifically for DNS requests, but also for other types, potentially malicious traffic, right? Like, we have done research in the past in other protocols that also have similar problems. So now, specifically for DNS, we would say rely on internal DNS servers and monitor the network closely.
100% agree. Some great advice there that people can follow and really implement from the ground down all the way up to the top. So I think that's some fantastic advice there, Daniel. And all I can say is thank you for coming on today's episode of Tech Chat, walking us through the report and helping us keep everyone safe. It's been great chatting with you.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you everyone who took the time to watch this episode. We hope you took a lot away, and if you want a more deep delve into the report, you can head on over to forescout.com/research-labs/namerec, or you can just head over to forescout.com and you'll be able to find the research there pretty simply. And it's a good read, and there's some good information to get out from it. We'll be back next week, obviously, with another episode in our Tech Chat series. Until then, you can join in the conversation at EM360Tech on Twitter and LinkedIn. Subscribe to this YouTube channel, and for more great daily content, head on over to em360tech.com.